At this point, you may well be tempted to go ahead and start creating your actual table that you're going to use on a website or whatever else. And in doing so, you may be tempted to use the root user when you're connecting to your database. This could become a security issue, however, because your root user is able to perform every single action within your MySQL database. There's no limitations on it, so they could, for example, drop all of the tables containing all of your data, and you not be able to restrict those permissions. Instead, you should create a separate user. So to create a new user, you simply type create user, and then you type the name of the user in single quotation marks. So in this example, I'm going to call this webmaster. And then you have an @ sign, and then in single quotation marks again, you have the name of the server that's running this MySQL database for you. So in this case, it's going to be localhost. When you run that command now, you will have created a new user, but you don't really want to leave it in that state. You want to assign a password to it, and so the easiest thing to do is to type set password, and then after the username and the host, type equals password, and then in brackets and in single quotation marks the new password. You also need to type the word for, so that you're specifying the fact that you're doing this for a different user. And when we run this command, we'll see that we've set a new password. Now if we start a new connection to the database, we can change this to webmaster, and we can store the password, which is my password, and then test the connection. We also need to name the connection. Now if we try to use the restaurant table, we're going to get an error. It's going to tell us at the bottom, access denied for user webmaster at localhost to database restaurant. And that's because by default, MySQL will give new users absolutely no permissions whatsoever. It's for you as the webmaster or you as the database administrator to go in and specify what each user is able to do. So if we go back over to our root user and delete this, we can grant permissions to individual users. And what this command does, it's self-explanatory really. It allows you to grant the permission to select data from the restaurant database and any sub-tables or queries or views or anything else that we store within that database. And we're granting that to the webmaster at localhost. So if we perform this action now and then switch back across to our webmaster account, we should now be able to use the restaurant, and we should be able to also select data from it. Now we haven't given our webmaster account permission to actually insert or delete any data, so we could, for example, try and drop the entire table, drop table staff, and if we execute this command now, we're going to get an error message which says drop command denied to user webmaster at localhost for table staff. And that, as I say, this is because we haven't, when we've granted permissions, gave the webmaster permission to actually drop tables. And this is a way that you can secure your database, especially if you have lots of different users accessing different parts of it. So some of the commands that you could give permission to are, as we say, drop, delete, update, insert, or if you wanted to give this webmaster root access equivalent to what the root account actually has, you can just type all, which wouldn't also be accompanied by all of these. There are many different permissions that you can grant to users, so if you do go down this route, I would suggest you look up exactly what the restrictions are and what permissions you can grant to each user to help you actually narrow down and give your users just the commands that they actually need to use. Now the next talking point for this line is this table or database part of the query. Here we've specified that the user is only allowed to access everything within the restaurant's database, but we could have multiple databases, for example, and we could therefore say that we want to give the webmaster access to everything. We could also limit them to just specific tables. And if we wanted to, we could also go as far as to limit them to individual columns that they're able to access data from within each specific table. As I've already said, the important thing to remember here is the fact that when you create a new user, that new user has absolutely no permissions to do anything within your database system whatsoever. The onus is entirely on you as to what you allow your users to do, and MySQL won't stand in your way when you're trying to do this. But that does mean that you should take the time to go out and study what permissions are available and who they should be granted to and in what circumstances, because ultimately, if anything was to happen to your data, there would be no one else to blame other than yourself. It's not very common, but it is possible to actually rename your user accounts rather than deleting them. You could actually change the name of this to web owner, for example, without going back to square one and deleting the webmaster user and then creating a new web owner user and creating all of the permissions for that new user. You can just use the command rename, and the syntax is just the current name followed up by the words to, and then the new name that you want to change to. And don't forget that you also need to put the host name as well. We also need to specify about renaming users. Now that will work. So if we was to close this session now and try to log back in with the webmaster account, we won't be able to perform any actions. We will in fact need to edit the connection so that we're actually using the correct details now. Now just a very small point about changing details like this. The actual changes won't kick out a current active session. So if this webmaster user was logged in at the time we changed their details, they would continue to be able to access they would continue to be able to perform their actions unhindered. It's only when they're creating a new connection or a new session that their details will be checked again. And this functionality is deliberate, according to MySQL. Now, as we've already granted permissions to our new user, we can also take permissions away. And we just do something very similar to when we were granting the permissions, and type revoke, and then the permission that we want to remove, and the database that we want to remove it from. followed by from, and then the user that we want to remove the permission from. When we perform this action, we'll obviously just take that permission away from the user. And so the user can no longer select functions after they've created a new session. But remember, as I said with renaming, the user does need to end their session and begin a new session for this change to take place. So if you were to revoke permissions to a certain database, that user would actually continue to be able to use those permissions until they had made a new connection. Now, we touched on setting passwords when we first created the user account, but we can also change the password from within the user account. We don't need to do it from the root account. And the functionality is simply set the word password and then equals, and then I'm using a password function here to turn another password into an actual hashed string so that MySQL will store the password properly. If you wanted to actually change the password from a separate application, maybe through a website for example, you could pass in a hashed password, which would just be a string, which would look something like this. And MySQL will save this without a problem. But because we haven't encrypted our password, we can use the password function. And this will encrypt it for us. It's not something that we need to do beforehand necessarily. So we can go ahead and perform this, and that will change our password to another password for us. Now if we wanted to change the password if the user forgot their password entirely, we could use the root account to change the password. And as you can see, the syntax is exactly the same, except we use the word for here, and then the name and the host of the actual user that we're amending the details for. And then again in this example we're using the password function to hash our password for us, so we don't have to hash it ourselves. So if we execute this command now, the password's changed to test. And this is one of the big reasons why a password for your root user should always be set, because your root user is able to change the password for any other user without any hindrance whatsoever. So just to recap what we've talked about, if you're using your database as part of a website, it's extremely unlikely that your website is ever going to need to drop tables. So creating and using an account which doesn't have access to the drop command will help your database's integrity. In fact, the account you use to access your database from your website should only really have access to the 4 basic data manipulation commands: insert, select, update, and maybe delete. It will be rare that you ever actually need to delete data from your database. You would more often than not just change the status of the data from live to not live. So giving your webmaster access to the delete command may not even be necessary. The same applies for the drop command, as well as many others. And this is why it's important that you take the time to actually figure out the actual permissions that you should grant to each user beforehand, before your database goes live on the internet. Finally, just to round this session off, when a user account is no longer needed, it's good practice to delete the old account, as doing so actually reduces the number of users that a potential attacker can use to gain access to your database. And this is just done with the drop command. So you drop user, and then you provide the name and the host. And when you perform this action, the web owner will be deleted. But again, remember that this doesn't change the fact that the user can still be signed in, and that user account will then be deleted, and so you can remove any connections that you have existing for that user.